Arguments are ammunition.
What did he expect in return? Should he not have given you money? Was the money not speech? It was just money after all. It's just like a hooker, I assume. So are you the prostitute? How did this work?
So before you take them into battle,
It's a factor.
It's a factor. I'll give you the factor business.
You did! You're giving me the factor! Common cause!
let's be sure that they work.
All right, welcome to the Proving Ground, where weak arguments come to die. I'm Richie Angel, here with Jacob Hibbard. This is a production of The New Guards, where we talk about a political issue, usually one that's in the national conversation, and discuss the best and worst arguments on both sides of the debate. We are on iTunes, on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and much more. Thank you for listening or watching wherever it is you found us. We just want to, before we get into today's topic, acknowledge some of the top comments from last week on our discussion about the Electoral College. We had one from Bob Mick, or Bob MC, from YouTube, where he talked about how the Electoral College can keep election fraud within states. For instance, if one state is more lenient on some of its voting laws and stuff like that, it at least stops at the border of that state. That was an interesting argument. And Aubrey Wilkins Worston on Facebook talked about how decisions should be made for a state by the people who know those that will be affected by the position. So essentially a federalism argument. That was also a really interesting one. Thank you to all of those who engaged with last week's episode. We really appreciate it, and let us know what you think. Before I get further into that and we talk about today, I do want to talk about why federalism arguments, though, typically are pretty compelling. Two federalism arguments essentially today that we're recognizing. Last week we recognized one. Usually federalism is a good argument, and this is why. Most political topics break down along ideological lines, left or right or whatever, and those focus on the size of government, how big it is, and the scope of government, how many areas it's involved in. But federalism sidesteps that issue and talks about who gets to decide what government does, the size and the scope and all that sort of thing. Is it the federal government or is it the states? And typically, whether you're big government, small government, whatever you are, people want to have a little bit more control over the things that are affecting them. So people tend to be more favorable to a federalism argument, even if they wouldn't otherwise agree ideologically. So Jacob, with that, I'll kick it over to you to introduce this week's topic.
So this week, we're going to be covering a topic that's recently been quite controversial, and that is the issue of big tech, specifically Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and the shadow banning or outright banning of conservative, alt-right, maybe even anti-Semitic, hateful speech on their platforms. And this has really kind of blossomed into an overall debate of like what kind of powers big tech can have. Can big tech or these Facebook or YouTube or these social media companies, can they ban people because they don't like what they say, because what they're saying? Do they, what is the boundaries that private organizations or private companies have when it comes to speech? This really came to the forefront when Steven Crowder, his entire channel was demonetized because a different group from Vox found what he was saying offensive, and they kind of lobbied YouTube for a little bit to try to get them to do something about it. And so to resolve the situation, they completely demonetized his channel. And then we here at The New Guards, the Proving Ground, which is a production of The New Guards, we've also experienced this on Facebook, where just last night, I wrote an article for thenewguards.net and posted it on Facebook. And according to Facebook's own numbers that it provides us as content creators, we have only reached, this article that we've shared on Facebook has only reached 367 people. While at the same time, Facebook is also telling us that 1,081 people have engaged with the post. And we've had over, let me see, what the current number is, almost 200 people have shared the article as well. So clearly, 1,000 people have engaged with a post that according to Facebook, they haven't seen. We've also had an instance where we had a post that, Richie mentioned this, I think our first episode, that we had a funny meme of kind of like totalitarian Valentine's Day cards, I think it was. And it's supposed to be a joke. One of them was Leon Trotsky thinks you're hotski. 3 months later, we got a notification from Facebook saying that our posts have been taken down for hateful or violating community standards. And so there's this kind of ongoing question for a lot of content makers. Some of you who might have YouTube channels or who go on Facebook might have had some of your things flagged or taken down as well. And so it's really opened up this big conversation of, what should Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter be allowed to do? Should the government step in and say you can't censor certain types of speech? Do you have to consider yourself either a platform or a publisher? There's, also, should this become a public utility? There's a really big, interesting, complex debate going on. And so we're going to talk about some of the weakest and strongest arguments on both sides of whether or not Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the social media giants need to be regulated by the federal government. And so I'll start us off with what I think the weakest argument on the side of regulation is. And that is that the First Amendment of the United States Constitution says that, freedom protects free speech, and me going on Facebook, me going on YouTube, or whatever platform it is, and saying something, whether it's not offensive or even if it is completely offensive, whether it's something horribly anti-Semitic or racist, the First Amendment protects my right to say that. And so Facebook, Twitter, YouTube are violating my First Amendment rights by banning or removing what I'm saying. Now, why is this a weak argument? This is a weak argument because the U.S. Constitution is in the Bill of Rights specifically, is designed to bind or delineate the powers of government and say what government can and cannot do. The Bill of Rights was drawing a line in the sand and saying government can't do these things and these things. When the First Amendment says, Congress shall establish no law, then establishing national religion, all these other things, but inhibiting free speech or the freedom of the press, it says Congress can't do that. It doesn't say anything about Facebook. It doesn't say Facebook. It doesn't say Twitter. It doesn't say YouTube. It doesn't say any of those things. It's completely a public sector, a governmental restriction. You can't come into my house and start yelling obscenities, and if I kick you out or say don't talk like that while you're in my home, I'm not violating your First Amendment speech. I'm not violating your free speech. You don't have that guarantee. You don't have that constitutional protection from a private entity. And so citing the Constitution or the First Amendment as somehow the justification for big tech being regulated by the federal government because they're censoring people, it's a false premise. You're putting a government something that's designed to affect just the government and introducing it into a realm that it doesn't exist in.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. That's exactly the weak argument that I have listed as well. Freedom of speech, freedom of association, First Amendment rights, they don't apply in the private context whatsoever. Certainly not on Facebook. But as far as the weakest arguments for not regulating, I would say the weakest one is when people say, well, what's the harm? Because they're really only going after the people who are the most extreme, like Alex Jones, conspiracy theorists, or they're going after alt-right or neo-Nazis.
Louis Farrakhan.
All these types of people, right? Now, what's interesting is that there's a potential logical fallacy in how you respond to that weak argument, and that's really where I want to focus it, which is that if your pushback is unsubstantiated, you could fall into a slippery slope fallacy. Slippery slopes are not always a fallacy, but if you say, well, if they're banning, the neo-Nazis, pretty soon they're going to be banning all the people in the middle. They came for me and I didn't speak up. They came for the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew, and they came for whatever. That can be a slippery slope. Just like saying, we're executing serial killers now. Next thing you know, we're going to be executing people for speeding tickets. That's not really an argument unless you have solid examples. And because here we've seen someone like Steven Crowder, who's a mainstream conservative voice, like him or not, who has the biggest conservative YouTube channel in history with over 3 million subscribers on YouTube. That isn't just taking out the people who are the most extreme. That's someone who's far more to the mainstream, who is now being taken out of the public discourse or being demonetized or whatever. So it's not just about that. Your slippery slope argument now withstands fallacy scrutiny, and thus making that argument. They're only going after the most extreme, so you have nothing to worry about, a much weaker argument.
Which is similar to my weak against regulations, just saying, well, just don't say offensive things, which you see this kind of argument thrown out for a lot of different issues. Like if in a later time we talk about domestic surveillance, you might hear this, if you're not breaking the law, you have nothing to worry about. It's a fallacious argument as well, because in this situation, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are the ones making the rules and defining what is offensive. We don't have a clear judgment or scale of what offensive speech is, or what would constitute that underneath their term of conditions. And so I don't know if I'm saying something that's offensive or not. I don't know, I could say something that could be considered by some people completely reasonable and other people would be completely offensive. It's such a subjective standard.
Learn to code, Jacob.
It's untenable to use that as a sort of defense of what's going on. And, there is a value to having free discourse, not to pull on the argument I just said that was super weak, but that kind of mentality, well, just don't say offensive things, opens a whole Pandora's box that we have no idea where it's going to go.
So now let's move on to the strongest arguments on both sides. I'll kick us off here with the strongest argument in favor of regulation. Now, this one has a couple of parts to it, but essentially it's all painting this picture that Facebook and other social media or big tech giants have so much power and control over you and over the public discourse generally that we kind of have to break that up. So for one thing, you'll often hear that they're a monopoly on digital communication. Facebook acknowledges that it owns 4 of the main 8 social media or social discussion apps in the world. So like a phone line, they're kind of the only way that you can communicate. And AT&T can't just hang up on you the second you start saying something hateful or bigoted, no matter how awful it is. Social media is also the #1 source of news. So they're kind of like a publisher, like the New York Times or like CNN or Fox News, but they're not really governed like a phone line or like a publisher, platform or a publisher. And so that makes them dangerous. They also have so much of your data that they can just give to anyone they want. That's kind of what you sign up for at a free service. If it's free, that means that you are the product and someone is coming is paying to come after you. So they have all this data, they have all this power, and therefore we need to push back on that. Either make them choose to be regulated as a publisher or to be regulated as a platform, but they have this middle ground where they have so much power and it needs to stop. It's a dangerous situation.
We need to have rules, essentially. If we're going to have this game, there needs to be some sort of rules so that we understand what we're doing. Are we dealing with the publisher? Are we dealing with just a neutral platform? Because different rules under current codes apply differently. If you're a public utility, like you mentioned, AT&T is governed by certain rules. And so if you're going to function like an AT&T, then we're going to apply those standards. Or if you're essentially the equivalency of a large, like New York Times editorial page, there are different reasonable expectations of what an editorial page would do. We just need to understand, essentially, what are you, so that we can fit you into whatever legal framework we have going on. And that's essentially, a lot of people like Ben Shapiro kind of make this argument of like, we need to figure out, are you a platform or are you a publisher? And so what I would my pushback on this, and that's probably different from yours, is why do we have to force a company to make that decision? What rights are being violated by Facebook as a private entity, or Twitter as a private entity, or Google, or whatever, YouTube? They're a private company who are operating. You are voluntarily going into an agreement with them. YouTube didn't make you get a YouTube account. Facebook did not. No one put a gun to your head, essentially, and made you create a Facebook account, and you're here on this platform without you choosing to be. You chose to go on there. You chose to enter into that relationship with them. So if they want to operate in this vague third-party space, no one's making you go there, and so you have essentially subjected yourself voluntarily to their rules. Why is that government's business if you voluntarily done it? If government, this is kind of a libertarian argument, if government exists to protect your rights, what rights of yours are being violated? Why does the government need to get involved? And so that's kind of one pushback you could have to, you need to pick a side. It's like, no, I don't. It's none of the government's business how I operate.
I would push back in a slightly different way, and that everything that Jacob said is fully valid there, but I would focus more on, okay, so if we're saying that they're the #1 source of news and thus they have too much power, well, why isn't the government stepping in to regulate Fox News, which is the #1 cable news network? Are these people who are calling for the big tech regulation, are they really asking for more government in that capacity? Do they really think that will help them when the government is in charge of the information and you have that Ministry of Truth scenario from George Orwell's 1984? The other one is, if you're going to focus on the platform side of things, Hollywood essentially has a monopoly on which movies go to the screen. So are you going to ask for more government regulation so that conservatives can make more movies? Because all those Hollywood liberals,
content neutrality in Hollywood, that's a great example.
all of these Hollywood liberals are only making liberal movies. We demand that we have our free speech recognized and we get a platform here. Or, Disney's not promoting the messages we want it to. They're going so much far down this progressive road, and we need to sue them or get more regulations so that they'll promote these family values. I don't think that that is really going to help anybody, nor do I think that that's really what the people calling for big tech regulation even want. But those are the logical ends of their argument. Taken to its logical conclusion, that's what it does.
You could also introduce just kind of the general antitrust arguments, in the sense that, there's the whole branch of antitrust law that, we want to prevent monopolies because monopolies hurt consumers. And that since Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all these things are essentially monopolies, we need to either break them up or establish some sort of regulation to control monopolies, because we don't want monopoly. You could also make the case to combat that idea in the sense that we don't want to punish an organization who's providing a product or a service that is so good that all consumers want to use it. Facebook must be doing something right, to be able to draw all of these users to it. Do we want to punish people or discourage entrepreneurship and the opportunity to make something big by saying, well, we don't want you to be so successful, because if you're this successful, then we're going to punish you. You make an argument that introduces an incentive that combats kind of creative production. We want people to be productive. We want them to be making money. We want them to be having this kind of success because, we have all these, kind of positive externalities, these benefits that happen to society from us having this. Us breaking it up or regulating it in some way is essentially punishing Facebook for being good at what it does. And, you can kind of question then the logic of, or the reasonableness of wanting to punish success. So that's another way you could push back against, this is a monopoly situation.
So Jacob, why don't you tell us what you think the strongest argument is in favor of Facebook regulation or big tech regulation?
So my argument, I think, applies better to YouTube, maybe more so than Facebook or Twitter, because Facebook and Twitter don't have as much, as far as I understand, as much monetization. But YouTube does a lot, like will monetize a channel or monetize a video to sell ads and things of that nature. And YouTube creators are able to gain money. Some people, that's their full income comes from their monetized YouTube channel. You can make a case that social media techs, YouTube, when they demonetize or when they label something as hate speech and then demonetize the video, so like a Steven Crowder could be an example, but a better example would be more of like an Alex Jones type, where we're completely banning you, and they've labeled him as a conspiracy kook, as he's insane, he's hateful, all these different things. You can make a case that this is defamation, and that this is not only just a not basic slander, but this is defamation with a property loss. And the Supreme Court established that within a defamation case, if you can establish that there's a harm, that there can be some sort of recompense given to you for defaming somebody. And so the current standard is that if a plaintiff in a defamation case is entitled to receive damages for any lost earnings, future lost earning capacity, and other lost business or economic opportunities that he or she has suffered or is likely to suffer as a result of the defamatory statement. So if I'm on YouTube, I have this platform that's monetized, I'm making money, or I'm anticipating that I'm going to make money, a reasonable expectation of making money because I have been making money from my YouTube channel, and then YouTube labels me as an alt-right, not, white supremacist, and boots me off or shadow bans me or demonetizes me. YouTube has labeled me, defamed me. If I'm not, let's say I'm not a white supremacist, but I'm being labeled that. They defamed me by calling me that, and then by demonetizing me, have deprived me of, they've harmed me economically. They've deprived me essentially of a property interest without any due process or anything of that nature. And so this is a defamation case with an economic harm that, at the very least, creators should be able to sue YouTube or sue these other platforms for damages, or government should step in and say, you have to have clear standards, or you can't demonetize or label somebody a certain way without either having a process, or we have to take this to court, something of that nature, because you're depriving somebody of a property right and you're harming them economically from defaming them by labeling them as hateful, racist, whatever it might be.
So I think the pushback here is twofold. Number one, within defamation law in the United States, it's you're allowed to get away with a lot more in how you label someone if they are a public figure. So you could make the argument that someone like Alex Jones, especially with as big of a following as he has, and even Steven Crowder, they are certainly public figures. And so you can say a lot more about them. And even if they're not public figures, people tend to speak in hyperbole. They may say that someone is more extreme than they really are to make their case. And this is just going to chill speech. But especially with a public figure, you have to be free to say, oh, that person is totally insane, without needing to provide the documentation from a clinical psychologist saying, yes, that person actually is insane. You're allowed to make these kinds of statements, even if they're charged or inflammatory. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that if YouTube is monetizing your channel, meaning YouTube is paying you to be on their platform, they're essentially your boss. And your boss in most states can fire you for being off-brand, for saying things that the company doesn't agree with. It doesn't matter how many customers you bring to the table for saying those things. If a company doesn't like the way you're expressing yourself while you represent them in their uniform, in their venue, then they can fire you. So if YouTube's your boss, then why can't they just demonetize your channel when you're off brand? They're a private company. They can establish their own brand.
Yeah, no, I think those are, really good pushbacks. And with the whole public figure thing, there's a whole new standard of when defamation can actually have some sort of damages. So you'd have to prove somehow that YouTube or whatever the platform you're on had malicious intent when they called you a white supremacist. And that's almost impossible to prove. That's why it's really hard for a public figure to win a defamation case. So, I think those are two really good pushbacks. I could maybe see somebody saying by me having my own channel that I'm not representing YouTube brand because I have my own channel. But then again, that comes into the question of whether or not YouTube then is a platform for you to set up your essentially your bodega, I guess you could say, your little shop of your channel, or is YouTube renting you space? Like a building manager, and it's renting you an apartment, and you doing something in your apartment is so damaging to its reputation or to other channels or somehow. Like a landlord, if you have an unruly tenant, a landlord, there are protections for tenants, but there's also you can make a reasonable argument that if a tenant of a certain area that they've rented is damaging or behaving certain types of behavior, that a landlord would have the right to break that contract or require that person to leave. Usually that would be outlined in the terms of conditions. So, there you can it depends on how, once again, it kind of goes, I guess, back to your thing. Is this a platform or is this a publisher? Because that you could kind of get into two different kind of counters or further arguments against this argument by how we're defining what YouTube's role is. Is it essentially a landlord leasing you space, or are you an employee?
Basically, everything comes down to that question of platform or publisher, and whether or not the government should force them to define which of those they are, or whether the government should choose and hold them to whichever standard. Some clarity would certainly be helpful, as it would help people know how to proceed. So moving to the other side, there's
one other thing I want to point out as well on the regulate side, and it's not so much a regulation as much as enforcing contract. If in YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, any of them, in their terms of conditions, if it doesn't have clearly stated terms, or it says that it can or can't do things, and it's willy-nilly changing those terms of conditions, then you kind of get into whether or not YouTube or Twitter are violating their contract they entered into with you. And so then that's just a suit for breach of contract. That's not a regulation. And regulation, when we talk about regulation, you're introducing something new. You can maybe just make the case that we just need to enforce current contract law and examine whether or not these big tech companies are violating their own terms of agreement, and in that case, suing them for breach of contract.
And that's part of the argument, essentially, the strongest argument in my mind for why you shouldn't be regulating big tech is that you already have things available to you, already have resources for going after YouTube if they violated their terms of service, if they promised you that you would get this money if you did these certain things. And for instance, with the Steven Crowder case, YouTube specifically told Crowder, you did not violate any terms of service, we're still demonetizing you. So he potentially has a breach of contract issue there. So that doesn't mean, though, that you need to introduce more regulation. And to continue that strong argument on the don't regulate side, you're not entitled to a platform. No one is forced to give you a megaphone. No private company has to let you come speak for them. And so a private company can do basically whatever they want as long as they're not, assertively hurting you, affirmatively hurting you, damaging you, or violating contract terms, their terms of service. They can do whatever they want. They can build their own website. They can keep people there if they want to. They can boot people off if they want to. It's a private organization, and it stinks because people like to use those organizations, but that doesn't mean that you have more of a right to be there just because it is that much more inconvenient for you to not be.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's essentially a property rights argument that YouTube as an organization is the private property of its ownership, who has entered into a voluntary transaction with you. You're not entitled to that person's property. You're not entitled to their services. You're not entitled to go into business, but you can't force YouTube to do business with you. And this is kind of the natural rights, property rights sort of argument or approach to this. And that's essentially the same argument that I would make as well for the strongest for don't regulate is like, you're not entitled to this. This is a voluntary transaction, a service you're engaging with voluntarily. This is not something that you have to make a contract with this person. So if it's a contract, it can't be a right. It can't be something you're entitled to if you had to enter into a voluntary contract with this person to get it. So the one pushback that you can do on this argument is essentially that, well, we limit the ability of people to use their private property all the time. Businesses are limited through public accommodations laws and through anti-discrimination laws as well. There are certain things that you can't do with your private property when it comes to interacting with other people in the marketplace. So like I mentioned, public accommodation laws, you can't discriminate people, or you can't turn down business from someone because they're black or because they're gay or because of that's actually a little bit fishy. We'll talk about that later.
That's a future episode.
On state levels, that's varying. But
national origin, race, religion,
exactly.
There are protected classes.
And that comes out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So you can we do that with those things. States have the power under the Constitution to do that as well. So what's different here? Why can't we just do that same kind of a thing and essentially create a protected class for ideology and for people who have certain different views? I mean, if you want to have a pluralistic society where we have the marketplace of ideas, where we can engage with each other and we have some sort of idea that the best ideas will rise to the top. If we're pushing people out and not allowing them to come in legally or letting private businesses do that, we're harming society, we're harming the discourse. These people have the right to the dignity of a YouTube channel, gosh dang it. So we got to let them on. And so you can kind of make, just expand the public accommodations anti-discrimination law to include people who have different belief systems than you do.
Most people tend to agree that discrimination, because it is so harmful, the government can step in and put at least some barriers around the type of discrimination that you're allowed to exercise when you step into the public and you're offering a service to people. And so, like Jacob said, you can create political protected classes or ideological protected classes, because the whole notion of free speech is that there be varying ideologies that can compete with one another, and you can't just arbitrarily silence views that you don't like. Now, just because a majority of people might agree with that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. That would be an appeal to majority, which is a logical fallacy. But it is a stronger argument for, we're already doing this. This is just a logical extension of the law that doesn't go much further beyond what we have already agreed to in a system that's not strictly democratic, but it does have these democratic tenets to it.
So basically, if you're going to push back against that, you have to attack then the whole premise of public accommodation and anti-discrimination law, which a lot of people aren't willing to go there. And it's shifting the argument. You're attacking a false premise then. You're essentially saying that there's a false premise to anti-discrimination law that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's a potential red herring. So anyway, that does it for this week's conversation. Please let us know what you think about this discussion. Should the government step in to add on additional regulations to big tech like YouTube and Facebook to prevent this type of viewpoint discrimination? Do you not think that this is a problem at all? Do you think it is a problem, but we should just let the private sector, the free market handle it? What would you like to see happen? And let us know. And let us know if there's any arguments that we missed. And we'll see you next week.